Wagwan, everybody. Welcome to the Dis-Affamie History podcast, where we'll be speaking about history and as well family history and how history relates in terms of Caribbean people for the present as well as in the past, and how in the past, what that does and brings forth for what we are going through at present and what we can learn from our history, from our family, and take that moving forward. So I do hope you enjoy the podcast. And if you like it, please ensure to subscribe, like, and review. Thank you.
In this episode, Wendy Aris will be joined with guest Kenneth Cuvalay, who is a member of St. Eustatius African Burial Ground Alliance. St. Eustatius African Burial Ground Alliance came about as a result of the protests against the excavations on an 18th century burial ground of enslaved Africans that were started by a team of international archaeologists in June 2021 in St. Eustatius. The discussion will be about demographics enslaved population, St. Eustatius at Emancipation, 1863. So let's have a listen.
Perfect.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to thank you, Kenneth, for coming on to the podcast today, Dis-Affamie History, and to speak about the St. Eustatius emancipation for the enslaved population on the island. And before we start, I know that you came on the podcast before, but again, if you could just do a brief introduction of yourself before we start.
Yeah. Well, good evening to the audience, to the listeners, and to you. And thank you for having me here again. My name is Kenneth Cuvalay. I'm a medical background. And basically, aside of that, basically my whole life, so to speak, busy with, education, awareness, and looking into our ancestral history and our tradition from day one, that in relation to how we are situated socially and economically speaking in after the abolition of enslavement of our ancestors, and looking at the continuing the impact as coming from the legacy of enslavement and the transatlantic trade and colonialism, how that continue to impact our people today. So I really, was brought up in a very poor family, had to go to school at a much later age, did that and continued to develop and myself and educate myself from that point of view up until today. I'm still educating. This discussion, the dialogue between me and you is education of itself. So, it's a continuing process when it comes to that. So it's a mixture of everything: history, education, the approach to decolonization in language, in the system, the institution, the structure, so to speak, what is still basically tremendously having huge negative impact on our community up until today. So the abolition of enslavement and speak about emancipation, when we speak about Emancipation Day, we are speaking in the Dutch situation, so-called the abolishment of slavery in 1863. It differed too, because if you look at St. Martin, it is 1848. You can speak about, if you look at Suriname, it is 1863 on paper when it comes to the Emancipation Act. But then the Dutch went on with the states control and to actually continue the trade of cotton, coffee, tea, you name it, in order to basically pay reparation to the enslaver. That is what it came down to. So I am constantly preoccupied, aside of my social medical work and so in community, which I still do, and basically looking as best as possible to try to engage with our community to regain the respect and sovereignty and dignity of our ancestors.
No, definitely. And thank you so much for saying that, because it is very important that we do, pay respect to our ancestors of people that came before us and to know what their story is and that we own it as well, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
this is good. This discussion, if I wasn't clear at the beginning to say this is about the demographics of the enslaved population in St. Eustatius at Emancipation, so 1863. So when we start, what inspired you to now look at the demographics of the enslaved population in St. Eustatius at Emancipation in 1863?
What inspired me is a combination of matters. Again, we go back to history. We look at least I then look at after the so-called, and that's why I call it so-called
Yes.
abolition of enslavement, because when you look at demographics and the position of our people, do we speak about the abolishment, the emancipation, you have all kind of different terminologies for it. When you look at the demographics, when it comes to white, African people, Indian people, Chinese, uh, Japan or whatsoever, what I'm seeing and what I think you will see in most of us who opens our eye clearly, whether it's in Brazil, Argentina, basically speaking, and that's why I speak about the continuation of the impact of that legacy. We are most of the time concentrated when it comes to that demographic in the same various communities, in ghettos, in poor, broken down housing facilities, low paying jobs where there's exploitation in a lot of ways. We have, yes, made some progress, that we have academics here and there and our people who have studied science to some degree. But again, that's also a mix up issue when you look at some of our academics, or most of them, I would say then, in Europe especially, the schooling of science which they went and they obtain are basically coming from the same colonial institution when it comes to the education. If you look at history and black historian coming out of one of the most famous universities in the Netherlands, which is called the Leiden University, where the embodiment of history is in there. That, per definition, academia, part of the academia within that academia, is a colonial setting and maintain up until today this what we speak about the legacy of colonialism in relation to Dutch past transatlantic slave trade. And so if you are not careful and go and get this Eurocentric form of education and cannot permit yourself to differentiate after that, use and take what is essential, necessary for you to be using, and continue to actually research your previous ancestral civilization and come out with that science. If you're not doing that, you will be having that education and you still be actually caught up into the colonial attitude and maintaining the colonial methods instead of emancipating ourselves in a genuine sense. Because basically, we are basically in a social, economical, and educational system which does not address our interests as African nor our history. So in that regard, we have to look further that education is obtained, see what is the truth and search for the truth and rewriting history in that context. And that's one of the challenges I would say when you ask me, when we look at the demographics, every other group, I don't like the word minority because I don't consider myself to be a minority. But when you look at other groups, you look at the Turks in a community in the Netherlands, they form a state in a state. They are having ownership to the infrastructure wealth of the country, the things like that. They have ownership to corporation building. Basically, African people in the Netherlands have ownership to nothing. We are consumers in general. And if you go back to the Caribbean, that's even worse because all of the corporations and all of the big businesses and the hotels are Chinese, Indians, white Americans, white South Africans, white Dutch people who are busy now with project developers in most of the Dutch territories where you can see definitely the development of classical ethnical cleansing and so we are in a very state of war just to survive, just to survive. We doesn't even realize that we're in a state of war in just to survive, maintain ourselves constantly around the globe in this society. We are underdeveloped. We are fighting to survive. We are poorly educated sometimes too, the massive of us. So when it comes to that demographic, most other groups have a whole different position in the society than we who came out of slavery, so to speak.
Yeah, you said a lot there because again, it's a lot about words that are used and looking at it from a different lens because from what we have been told of what our history is and for us to then to be able to find out what our history is. And I think that I guess we'll talk more about in terms of what you said in terms of if we're truly out of emancipated, so to speak. But in terms of the demographic, this, I think, is the more important feature of what was that population in St. Eustatius during the emancipation in 1863.
Well, predominantly the African community still, because basically what the European did, they extinct almost all of the indigenous people, which, the Caribbeans, the Arawaks, you're not allowed to call them Caribbeans anymore because they're progressive insight to those terminology as well. But those were the people who were really as well went through the torment of enslavement, but a lot of them died from disease, weakness, etc., and couldn't withstand the torment which they were put in. So, and by the way, a lot of them resist to where the European has already had the gunpowder, and so they really kill and extinct almost all of the indigenous people to that degree. And there's where one start looking towards Africa. And there's where we really came in because the plantation had to continue. The enslavement of taking over the region and the assets from the region and to generate production, you needed people to do that. And there's where one headed towards Africa and there's where we came in other people who basically had been proven to be having more stronger resistance against the horrendous and barbaric torment which we went through, our ancestors went through. Because if that was not the case, I don't think we would have been around today, seeing the torment our ancestors endure. And our ancestors put up furious resistance and so in order to liberate themselves. So the real liberation, emancipation, is not what, and I always disregard that because how could you tell me at a point in time when you come by force and commit the most horrendous form of crime in the context of a Holocaust, and then at a point in time you say, well, okay, today on the 12th of June, I set you free. Nobody cannot set me free. I'm the only one who can set myself free. So, the real freedom came from the resistance of our ancestors, not on really what is on paper. It's like Martin Luther King said in one of his quotes, if I do it correctly, a bootless people, what the enslaver said, strap up your boots and, figure it out. Now, it is a horrible thing to say to a bootless person or bootless people who didn't even have boots. Go and strap up your boots and figure it out. Again, and you look at the proclamation and the abolishment in the US. Hundreds of acres of economical starting by giving immigrants from Europe land. That is an economical start which you boost the people with by giving them hundreds of acres of land to start with. The enslaved African never had one dime. And that impact that you were forcefully enslaved. Everything was stripped from you. And at the point you say, well, you're free, we give you freedom. You're free now, on the 12th of, 1863. And, strap up your boots and go forward because you have freedom now. But at the same time, people coming from Ireland, the rest of Europe, you name it, the Italians, all of them, they got hundreds of acres of economical stand in the form of land. The enslaved people, African by force up until today, never had one bit of land given to them to have an economical stand. So it's a criminal statement to say to a bootless man or woman, strap up your boots and, go and build yourself on nothing when you don't even have good boots on your foot.
Yes, it's definitely not even giving them a fair shot, so to speak, because as you mentioned, others were able to come and to be able to get, as you said, an economic boost than they
Yeah.
have.
Yeah. European from all over Europe, like the Italian, the Irish, you name it. All of them got on hundreds of acres of land when they reached just to start. That's an economical start. And the people who were enslaved by force and were brought against their will in that continent were not given one dime, nothing, not even a pair of boots to strap up and go forward on.
Mm-hmm. So how did, I guess, structure, so age, gender, how did that reflect the conditions of the enslaved on the island? Was it more that it was young people or more that it was older people? How did that reflect?
During the so-called emancipation period and following up, I think basically, if you look at the African community, it was a combination of more imbalance, women and men and children were I think in a relatively good balance. It wasn't as if you still see that on the island today as you continue generation after generation. The African community on the island, when it comes to men and women and children, are still basically the biggest part of the say composition of demographics when you speak about demographics, at least on St. Eustatius. Saba is a complete different other situation. Saba is, for instance, was from day one, a lot of white people and enslavers who settled in Saba. It's like it is a 50-50%, although today's a bit more mixed with different people from other destinations. Today you have Chinese on Saba. I think some 20 years ago, you with a big magnifying glass, you would not find a Chinese on Saba. Today you have Chinese with Chinese restaurants. So, but basically, Saba was basically and still continue to be dominated demographically in economical content as well in relation to ownership of that economical infrastructure by white people who originated from Scotland and all of those different parts of Europe. So, and you'll find the African community is still struggling. They're still the second class or third class citizens in Saba up until today and being discriminated hugely. So that is the image of Saba. St. Martin is a mixture of everything. Chinese, after a while, the people start coming from different parts of the world. And so a whole development of mixed demographic took place, and you can see that image. Although in St. Martin, there was a point in time not so long back, I think that probably would be a 40 years ago, one sector of St. Martin, which you call Simpson Bay, was purely white and inbreed as well, because most in Saba you have a lot of inbreeding as well, because the white does not mix with other races, so you have inbreeding. And so that kind of died out in St. Martin, in Simpson Bay, because of naturally the dominant influx of other people from other communities. Although when you speak about African people and you talk about Latin African people again, there's a lot of African descent who are Latin from the Latin American part of the Caribbean, for instance, Colombia, Santo Domingo, like I said earlier, which actually originally is Haiti. You will find blacks, they are Latin, but they are black and coming in, and they have been seen as Latin. But at the same time, I say again, when I look around, we are speaking about African people of descent. Although among each other, sometimes we tend to see each other differently just because of nationality in that context. And a lot of these people, I was speaking to a lady on the island in August, and I said, "Oh, I asked her where she's from." She said Santo Domingo. I said, "Okay, that was former Haiti. Then you're African as well." She said, "No, I'm not African. I'm Dominican." So again, here's where you have our own people are so much in denial about themselves at the same time. So when you speak about that demographics, indoctrination, and I'm not even talking about religion, because that's even worse. Our people are very fundamentalist in religion, which is not their religion, but then you can become enemy just by talking about these things among our people. So that's a big problem as well. So, the demographic has dynamics which are really playing out. At the same time, you're seeing a lot of other groups, especially European and American white. They're the ones who really are in control of these region, economically speaking.
So, based on what you're saying, there hasn't really been a change. And it's just, I guess you can say, almost a play on words, that you're free. But in terms of who is actually controlling, I guess, the purse strings, it is still kind of maybe not the colonizer, but definitely is others that are part of the impact of all of this.
Well, I tend to call them still colonizers, because, when you analyze their way of doing, if you take the Dutch, for instance, how Dutch nationality, what does that mean exactly? You have that nationality, but still you have been seen differently as African with that same nationality versus a white Dutch person. So that already is a problem when it comes to racism and discrimination. You have been seen not equally speaking. So when you look at the methodology and the method and who's in control and how that control is taking place, it is a form of colonialization at the same time, which continues. Because when you're going to systematically dominate in a country, a people who's supposed to have their freedom to decide their destination, but because of your system, which they are locked into, and that is a dominant system, whether it's legislation, whether it's the form of education, that community does not decide anything. You are the one who are deciding how the educational system should be actually composed. What should you teach? If you take history, you may learn everything about Shakespeare, the French Revolution. But if you find a half of a 4 page of a paper with African history is a lot, it's an exception. So again, for me, these are colonial methods.
Definitely. And I know that you probably, you kind of said this in your last or the previous answer, but can you just go over in terms of the impact did this transition to emancipation have on on these demographic trends?
Yeah, well, the impact is huge in the sense of, again, on how to come back to religion, education, self image. How do a lot of our people see themselves? Because the dominance of white supremacy, like they call it, is prevalent. And somehow, a lot of our people in this regard, and I think a lot has to do with even after the so called abolition of slavery, all that was on paper done. It took the Dutch state more than 400 years to acknowledge the crime. So I think from a psychological point of view, when you dehumanize a population and you scrutinize them as being less, it continues to impact the self image and the way you perceive yourself. So when you ask me about that impact, and I look and I differentiate or analyze what religion is still having on our people as an impact, what the type of education is still having on our people as an impact, what the king of the Netherlands is still having on our people as an impact, because, with the so-called king, apology, please forgive me, a lot of the people were impacted and emotional, in the sense of what a great thing this king did. I don't consider what the king did as anything great. I mean, we are speaking about huge crimes against humanity. And I don't see no way how I can forgive you. I don't see no way how you can repay me for those damages. That's why I said in many ways, when we speak about reparation, it is us who should demand morally and define reparation. But even to that, when it comes to money, when you look at the horrific damages and crime which have been done and the continuation of the impact, there is no way you can find any sum of money to quantify enough to justify or to actually, you know, say it's in balance with what really has been inflicted upon our people. So it's a complicated issue. And when you speak about it, we need to be very careful as to how we differentiate the situation today in relation to then, because a lot of ideas are there. Well, you all have your freedom now. It's been so long ago. We shouldn't be talking about these things. Nothing is so long ago, because again, the social, economical underdevelopment and the state which our people continue to be in after all of this emancipation talk has very, very, very little has been achieved up until today. Even to the mother country, the motherland. All our wealth, our resources in the hands of big outside corporations like DuPont, Shell, and you name it, what's the other organization, Unilever, and all of these kind of, you know, we are a rich continent, but yet we are not in control of our own wealth. So, I mean, African countries have obtained independence as well, different parts of the country. But yet, our wealth, the African Union is in debt to the European. I mean, it's just, how must I say, it's ironic. The African Union, which is coming from the richest continent on this planet, should be in debt to Europe.
Should be. It shouldn't be, but that's a whole other discussion.
I know, but it's just to give you an example whereof colonialism is still live and kicking in so many ways.
Yeah, not in the more, I guess, obvious ways is what, more than anything else. And I guess the next one is just how, with the family structures among the enslaved people, what was the influence post-emancipation within the community?
It depends where you are, because if you look at, for instance, our ancestors who fought the way and went to Cuba, the Igbos, for instance, they really actually had strategy to confirm themselves with, for instance, Christianity, to survive and to, maintain their developing position in community. But from within, they maintain a lot of their own traditional ancestral ritual and traditions. So, and if you go to Haiti, you'll find the same thing. If you go to the inner land of Suriname, which they call them the forest Negro, which I find is a strange name. And, this is another label. These are our ancestors who, like I said earlier in the first discussion we had, who overthrew and took their freedom and went deeply into the inner land of Suriname. And so a lot of these ancestors, our ancestors, maintain a lot of tradition and rituals to some extent. And you'll find that back in places like Haiti, for instance. But then if you take the Dutch territories, for instance, we are overcompensated with Western tradition, ideas, thinking, although to some degree, when it comes to the family system, you still find African principles, although one would not be aware that there's an even African principle. Coming back to what we had a discussion earlier, who's running the family system? It is the woman, the female with those children. In European context, that's not per definition the tradition. Tradition in European context is men and women are equal, and well, we are equal, but there are different roles. Let me put it that way. We tend to see, because of the female who will be there in that family system, maintaining that, Europeans tend to see that the woman has no rights. She is not equally treated because she's just a housewoman, a wife or housewoman. But I tend to see those things differently, because it's a role in society, and our ancestors never said to the woman, you shouldn't think, you shouldn't be educated. It's education comes in so many forms. The mere fact to build a village and how a village stay the pillars of development, where the female in all of these societies basically is the backbone of having these pillars stay intact so community can develop. That is of itself, within itself, education and having a very important role in society. So we tend to see, from a Western point of view, suddenly the woman are not having a degree, a PhD. She's not. It's like I always draw the example. I say, you look down on the garbage collector, but let's say for one day that the garbage collector stop picking up the garbage for the next coming year. What will happen to society? Diseases will break out. So again, when you ask me that question, we tend to forget or overlook the role and the significance of the role of our own African women in our society, even up until today.
Because basically you're saying the African proverb of it takes a village, right, to raise a child.
Exactly.
So, now, with this, and you kind of alluded to this before, is that, were there any significant migration patterns related to the population after emancipation?
For instance, the Dutch territories, for instance? Well, okay, there was a back and forth. Then you see, based on poverty then, and the so-called brainwash that because you have a Dutch passport of Dutch nationality, you're better off than our so-called, our brothers and sisters who have a British passport, that's a less significant passport. So I don't even look at the passport. I look at the condition. And if you take Walter Rodney, for instance, who wrote a book, but again that would be another discussion for another day, how Europe underdeveloped Africa, you are seeing a systematical similar underdevelopment in the same region versus the Dutch territories and that of the former British territories and even the French territories. What you see is that the Dutch have a more sinister way of actually making you think you have a more privilege or you are more progressive going forward with the Dutch passport, but at the same time, what the Dutch is really giving you is just enough for you not to drown. You're drowning, but just enough not to keep you from drowning. When you look at the so-called better off territory in chances of getting a job, you saw a lot of people move from, for instance, British Islands and immigrate to the Dutch territories for that matter, because somehow wages were much better in certain ways so than in the British territories at the time. And you're still seeing that kind of a mobilization that you have a lot of, you have, for instance, in Eustatius, the Guyanese community, you have the Santo Domingan community. They come to stage the Dutch plate because it's a combination too. There's work which a lot of the Dutch nationals wouldn't want to do anymore because they feel themselves more privileged to some degree. So these people from St. Kitts or Haiti, the Dominican Republic, they will do these jobs which our African brothers and sisters say, well, that's not that's too much of a low job for me to do, you know. So these people will come, they'll do those type of jobs, but at the same time, they build economically themselves in the community because right now most of the restaurants and bars, locally speaking, belonging to people from the Dominican Republic. The bakeries, most people, Dominican Republic. So, and they come with a mission. They come to make money, to send money back home to better their family. And we got lost somewhere in between with being Dutch, thinking we are being Dutch. We have this nationality. So we are so better off when that is far from the reality. And I think recently with COVID and everything after the transition in October 2010 has proven them differently because all of a sudden the burden of agony and disparity is increased hugely. And you find yourself thinking, well, I'm supposed to be equal because I have this passport, but in practical sense, that's far from the reality. So to answer that question, yes, how people who migrated from various parts of the different region to the Dutch territories and continue to be the case today as well.
Wow. And then, of course, with this project, how does it address the legacy of enslavement and emancipation?
Which project you're speaking about?
This one here in terms of the demographics.
Oh, well, the project, well, we are speaking a lot about demographic, but the project of itself is naturally is coming from the Faro Treaty, where we are actually going to be looking at marginalized and endangered African heritage on the island. That's basically the aim of the project with community engagement, awareness and education in relation to heritage, history, etc. Also, we're going to be looking at unethical methods of archaeology and all of those different things. So the demographics plays a role into that whole project as well. So the questions you are asking in relation to demographics is embedded in our project as well as we approach community. So, and basically we are very much emphasizing on the African community. We are not really interested in white European community on the island. Instead of that, we going to be showing the contrast as to how exploitation or, you know, on not being equal at the same time. What is happening because our heritage here and our ancestors remains within the industry of archaeology of itself. It's been looted, take off from the islands, end up in Western universities. These people experiment, do DNA research on the remains and so forth. They write their books and get big grants to promote their books. Etc. We are not being asked a question in this regard to our heritage and our ancestors' remains. So indeed, your question is very much founded into the project as it is in a broader context.
Perfect. And then how can someone participate, whether they can volunteer or whether they can donate to the project?
Well, it depends when you speak about donate. In this case, donate, we were looking for people who can join alongside the alliance to whether it's administratively, communication skills, etc., which we can use people, their expertise in that area. Right now, for the communication campaign of the project, we can really use hands on board people who have skills in social media, but also broader communication skills and so forth, and administrative work as well at the same time, because to answer that question, that would be donation in a natural sense, but the project has been financed with on the submittal. We submit our project proposal when they did the Faro call in Europe. So we obtained something like 32,000 euro to do this project. But the alliance work is not being financed by nobody. All of the alliance work outside of the project, which is I just explained that we actually were awarded for, which at the end of the day, for spending every cent on this project, we have to give at the final part of the project accountability for the money. So, but our work as a grassroots movement of itself is all based on our own natural resources and strength. We don't. So we are thinking about now, yes, how we can talk with other brothers and sisters in order to, have some form economical resources to do our work outside of the project proposal. And I say, on the other hand, we really broke colonial structural barriers because we are a grassroots organization, the Central African Burial Ground Alliance, but you're not in the Dutch context what they call a legal entity in the sense you're not a foundation. And I find grassroots organizations who are doing community work should be seen equally to that who had the name of a foundation. Because, being a movement, not because you're a foundation, you're doing more important work, or better work than a grassroots movement. So in our sense, we really broke and made history by applying for that, to submitting a project proposal and being awarded still for it. So there again, we are changing the dynamics of colonial approach and policies. Let me put it that way.
No, and that's absolutely fantastic. And I will put the link to your website. So if people want to look at that and to see, they definitely can. And, as we come to a close with this episode, and it's really been quite interesting, what can you say, I guess, as your final thoughts that you'd like to leave the listeners?
My final what?
Your final thoughts.
Oh, my final thoughts. Again, my final thoughts could be, that person is interesting because you're challenging me there to go into different directions, which are subjects for another day. But the final thoughts are various. The final thoughts I would like to continue to emphasize on is coming together as a people. Like me and you are having this dialogue right now. It takes, how you said that version a while ago, how to build a village. It takes a community. Right, right. we need to go back to these principles, and we need to connect regionally, interregionally, and globally, because we are actually the only people on this planet which I notice are very much fragmented and actually having these antagonistic forces among ourselves. And we are a great people. It's like Marcus Garvey said, up you mighty people and accomplish what we need. We can do that. So we need to go back to our principles, our beliefs, not religion, beliefs, our traditions, our philosophies of our ancestors. They are there. We just have to put them back into position. So my final thought would be to call upon us and continue to call upon us to take on that challenge with a broader vision.
Thank you so much, Kenneth. I really did enjoy you speaking on this, because it is a lot of the themes that we don't really talk about and we don't really discuss because of, the pain. And of course, some people have it as shame as well. But thank you so much for your time and for coming onto the podcast. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much as well for giving me that opportunity. And thank the audience who will be listening to us as well.
Hoped you enjoyed this episode. And if you did, please make sure to like, follow, subscribe, and write a review for the episode wherever you listen to your podcast. Thank you.